Hi everybody, Carmen here with Quality Sewing, and for this week's How Do I, we are going to cover how do I know what those general sewing terms mean. So recently, as we were brainstorming some different ideas, we realized that there are a lot of sewing terms out there. In fact, when we have new hires, we have a document that has like 120 different sewing terms on it, which sounds like a lot. Don't worry, I'm not going over 120 terms today. That might, overwhelm all of us. But we are starting a new series where we're going to break down different sets of general sewing terms, garment sewing terms, quilting sewing terms, overlocking sewing terms, that sort of thing, because there's a lot of different words out there that are connected to sewing, and if you've never sewn before, or if you haven't sewn that often, or maybe you've never quilted, you might not know what those things are. So today we're kicking it off with 10 of our basic or like general sewing terms, I think is more the right way to say it. So these are just good general sewing terms, and these are awesome if you are brand new to sewing, if you haven't sewn that much, maybe you have a sewing machine at home that you haven't used very much. We're going to go over some of those basics today. So we're going to start off with the bobbin. So a sewing machine, the way you create a stitch is you have a bobbin in the bottom and you have a spool thread in the top and you have a needle, and together those things make that stitch. So you can see here, I have all these different little bobbins. So now bobbins are different depending on the machine. You can actually see how these have different, they look different. The sizes are different. Like look how big this guy is. This is a big Bernina bobbin. If you want lots of thread on your bobbin, Bernina has a pretty big bobbin. But so it's really important with your bobbin to make sure you're using the bobbin that is designed for your machine, because every bobbin, not every bobbin, there's quite a few bobbins that are similar, but you want to make sure you have the right one, because as you can see here, I have 5 different types of bobbins that have different widths, different sizes. So you want to make sure you have the right bobbin for your machine. So now let's take a peek at the sewing machine and see where this bobbin actually is. So your bobbin lives right in here. So the bobbin is right down here. On some machines, it would be in the front down here, but that bobbin lives here, and the bobbin is sort of spins in a circle or oscillates back and forth, and that has the thread on it, and it creates a stitch with your upper thread. Okay, so the next term is presser foot, and you can see here, we have the presser foot right on the machine, and presser feet also, similar to the bobbins, come in all different shapes and sizes, all different types of presser feet here. You can see, our camera will zoom in there so you can see it, so it can focus. So you can see all of these different presser feet. Some just snap on like this guy here. Some actually go into the shank like this guy, but they come in all different shapes and sizes. And the reason why you need a presser foot is because that is what's going to hold your fabric flat. So that way the fabric stays flat so you can stitch over it. And now what's really cool is with presser feet, there are different presser feet for almost every application. So like this is a buttonhole presser foot. This is a sewing on the button presser foot. This is a decorative stitch presser foot. This is a rolled hem presser foot or blind hem presser foot. So there's all sorts of different styles and types of presser feet. And what's cool about this is these feet help you be more successful with your different sewing projects, right? Because sometimes when I'm quilting, I might use a quilting presser foot. When I'm sewing on a button, I'm going to use that presser foot. When I'm making a buttonhole, I'm going to use the buttonhole presser feet. Now, if you have a new machine to you and you're not sure how to use these things, over at Quality Sewing WA, our YouTube channel, we have a whole series on Learn to Use Your Sewing Machine, and we talk about what those sewing feet are for that come with your machine. So that is a great resource. And then, of course, if you live locally in Western Washington or in Tri-Cities, we do have 11 stores where we teach free Learn to Use Your Sewing Machine classes, no matter when or where you purchased it. Okay, next, let's go on to the needle and the needle threader. Okay, so I put needle threader in here because oftentimes I find that people don't realize their machines have a needle threader, and it is my favorite feature on my sewing machine because it's hard to see that little needle. So you have that bobbin and that needle, and those threads together are what make that stitch. So here on this machine, I have it all set up, but I'm just going to show you how the needle threader works because it's pretty slick. I just go boom like this, and voila, my needle is now threaded. So needles are also an important component of your machine because there's all different types of needles, and you want to change your needle every 8 hours of sewing. And this is really important because sometimes when our machine's just misbehaving, what do you need to do? Change your needle. You'll hear me say it over and over again. So needles are pretty awesome. If your machine doesn't have a built-in needle threader, there are little tools that can help you thread the eye of your needle if you have a hard time seeing it. Okay, next, we are going on to back stitching. So the back stitch is super important. If you were just to start sewing and you didn't back stitch, your seam might just bust all the way open. So the back stitch is that locking of the stitch at the beginning of your seam and at the end of your seam. It's usually 2 or 3 reverse stitches to secure that stitch. Okay, and some machines, you're just gonna use your reverse button. You would just start sewing and then use your reverse button right here, and it would lock it for you. But this machine is pretty slick because I was able to turn on automatic tie off. So it's going to do my lock stitch for me. I'm just going to hit start here and it's going to go forward, backwards. There we go. Now it's going backwards, locking my stitch and then continuing forwards, which is pretty awesome. And then when I get to the end here, I can actually just tap my reverse button and then it will go backwards there, lock my stitch, and come to a complete stop. So this is a really nice feature that a lot of machines have, and of course you can just do your reverse, but when you have your, when you're doing your back stitch, it's going to do, you're going to lock the stitch at the beginning and lock the stitch at the end, okay? And let's see if I can get this so you can see, maybe if I put it here, you can see the stitching a bit better. So that is what the back stitch is, or the tie off, or the locking stitch. There's lots of different ways that we talk about that same thing, and all of those words are back stitch. Okay, and you want to do that at the beginning, at the end. There's a couple of times in sewing where maybe you aren't locking your stitch, but generally you want to lock your stitch at the beginning and the end because you don't want to take all that time and do all that work and then have it just open all up. Okay, next we are going to go to the seam. So the seam is what we just made. It's the line of stitches that joins your 2 pieces of fabric together. So you can see here we have our seam, and maybe I'll just bring it over here. Let's try it over here in this camera and see how that does, if you can see it, how well you can see it. Yeah, I should not have done blue on blue. This is where live things aren't great. You can sort of see it there, but basically my stitch is here, and so it has created the seam, okay? And when we flip this over, right? Now you would iron this and you have this beautiful seam just like that, and voila. So the next part of our seam is our seam allowance, right? Now the seam allowance is all of this extra space. It's the distance from the edge of the fabric. It can be 1/4 of an inch, which is oftentimes for quilting. It can be 3/8 of an inch, which is often, or 5/8 we often use for garment construction. But it is all of this extra fabric here, okay? And depending on your application, you're going to want a different seam allowance, right? So you can see here with this one, I have a very large seam allowance, right, for purpose of demonstration. This is a very big seam allowance. You can see that there. Really large seam allowance. Actually, maybe if I pull it like this, you can see it better. There we go. That's probably an easier way to see it. So you can see here, this is a really big seam allowance. And so the important part is when you are looking at a pattern, it's going to tell you what the seam allowance should be, okay? And so if the seam allowance says 1/2 of an inch or 3/8 of an inch or 1/4 of an inch, you're gonna wanna make sure that you guide your fabric through your machine so you only have 1/4 of an inch next to your seam, or 1/2 of an inch. Now there are feet that can help you keep that lined up. There are also seam gauges. Some people put a piece of tape on the front of their sewing machine here, and they'll throw a little piece of tape that will say, okay, well now I know this is where my 5/8 is. This machine also shows me right here on my needle plate that my 5/8 is here, which is sort of handy because there's all these markings on the back of my needle plate. And so that is seam allowance. Okay, next is probably one of my favorite things, notions. Now, industry-wide, we all sort of know what notions are, But, you know, often when I'm talking with people who have never done any sewing, they're like, well, what's a notion? So notion sort of has there's sort of two definitions when I looked it up, right? One is it's small items that help you finish your garment or your project, right? So buttons, zippers, hooks, tapes, etc. And it's also a term used for all of the different tools and accessories and all of the different bits and bobs that we use when we are sewing. All of these things would be considered a notion, okay? We have all of this stuff. You've got zippers here, I've got tape, I've got scissors, needles, a turning tool, a rotary cutter. I almost called that a seam ripper, but y'all, you know that you need a seam ripper too. That is definitely missing from here. That is a key element to anyone who is sewing, because unfortunately we all need a seam ripper. But all of those things are called notions. So it's a very large category. And like at qualitysewing.com and in our stores, we have tons of different notions for all different types of sewing, quilting, embroidery, serging, all of that stuff. We have all of the different tools that you might need to be successful depending on what sort of project you are doing, because there is a different notion for pretty much every project. And of course, once you find out what you love to do, you can just get the notions that support the part of the sewing projects that you love. Okay, next we're going on to salvage. So salvage is this. So I've got a piece of fabric here. This is just a yard of fabric that I've cut, not quite a yard. But the salvage is the finished edge of woven fabric. Okay, and it's put on here so it prevents the fraying. And you can see here, usually the salvage is very clear on the edge of your fabric, right? Because it's like a band here. The cool thing also about salvage is, like, for this is a Tula pink piece of fabric, and it has these little color swatches here that's showing me all the different colors that are in this fabric. So that way, if let's say I'm making something and I want to pick an accenting color to support this beautiful pattern fabric, I could match it right here from the little guide on the salvage. The salvage also tells us, maybe I'll put it down here so you can see it a little bit better, move all my bits and bobs. It also will tell you often, like, what the fabric is. And the reason why I find this also helpful is, let's say I need some more raw fabric, right? Now I can call Quality Sewing, or I can check it out to figure out if I can get some more of this exact fabric, because I can see right on here what the fabric is. There are all those little color swatches that tell us the colors that are in here. So that is pretty helpful. So that is what the salvage is. Sounds like a tricky word, but it's really just the edge of the fabric with some notes. Okay, and then we are gonna talk quick about basting. So a basting stitch, once again, we will see if you can see it here. A basting stitch is a stitch that you are going to do whenever it's like a temporary loose stitch to gather or hold something in place. So this can be done by hand, or I honestly try to do almost everything on my sewing machine. So I just use my sewing machine, and what I do is I make my stitch length really large. So normally your stitch length would be like 2.5 or 3, but your machine should have a 5 or a 6 millimeter stitch length, and then it makes it really loose, and this would be one that you don't want to tack it. Oh, I'm pulling here where you can see. You don't want to tack it down, right? You're not going to do that back stitch when you do a basting stitch, because you're going to probably rip it out. You're just using it to sort of hold some stuff in place, and then you want it really easy to just be able to pull it out. See how easily I can pull this out? You want to just be able to pull it out when you're done with it, but it creates a very big, loose stitch that sort of is holding everything together. So that is basting. And then finally, one that definitely confuses a lot of people, bias, right? So we're going to talk about the grain of the fabric, okay? So bias is the diagonal direction of a piece of fabric. It's 45 degrees angle to the salvage, from the salvage to the grain line, and this provides the most stretch in fabric. So let's just look at this piece of fabric here. Okay, so once again, I've got this big old piece of fabric, okay? So let's talk about it here. So the top part, this top right here, is called the cross grain, and this is going away, and you can see it has a little bit of stretch, okay? And then on the salvage line here, generally, or the way that the selvage is, right? This is the grain itself, and there's no stretch. There's usually almost no stretch on this part of the fabric. We have the cross grain has stretch, the length of the grain, which is what this is called, or it could be, we're looking at it this way, this would also be the length of grain, but usually for me, from the way I can tell, right, is where is my selvage, right? That gives me the pro tip, and that has no stretch. But if you want a lot of stretch, if you cut this on a 45-degree angle here, this is what the bias is. Now this has a lot of stretch, okay? Bias has a lot of stretch. Now you might be wondering, if you haven't done a lot of sewing, well, who really cares, right? Does it matter? It does matter, because there are times when you want your fabric to be stretchy. And there are other times where, if like on the outside of a quilt block, you have a whole bunch of stretchy fabric, it might actually change the shape of your quilt block. So when you are looking at a pattern, it is going to tell you how to cut the fabric. Okay? And that's why it's important to know what the bias is, what the length of the grain is, and what the cross grain are, because that will help you cut the fabric correctly so you are most successful when you create that pattern, that quilt, whatever it is that you're making, so that way the fabric does what it is supposed to do and it helps you out instead of becoming difficult and making your project not turn out as well. So that was our top 10 general sewing terms. And like I said, there are literally hundreds of sewing terms, right? So we are going to do some more of these over the next coming months, where we will dive into the top 10 garment terms. We'll dive into the top 10 serging terms, the top 10 quilting terms, because there are a lot of different terms depending on what sort of sewing, quilting, serging that you are doing, but I hope this was helpful. And of course, we go live every Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. Pacific time, and we're qualitysewing.com and Quality Sewing. We have 11 locations in Western Washington, so check out our website. And of course, comment here if you have any questions, because we always answer the questions. Have a great day. See you next time.